So are there some questions from the audience that you would like to discuss regarding, the combination of the talks that we have seen or some overarching aspects? Yes, Petra? Yeah, so I would say in my experience, I'm not sure that we're going to find only the pragmatic processing factor, let's say. In some other experiments that we did that I didn't report here, we tried also to see, for instance, how consistent are people in their behavior with respect to being literal or pragmatic interpreters across different types of pragmatic experiments. And in the study, we both had a longitudinal component where people came back because we wanted to see how much is it the mood of the day and how much is it, replicable behavior. And we had, combination of different tasks. So, for instance, the atypicality inferences that I talked about, but also just scalar implicatures. And we found that, there was some consistency with respect to answers, whether somebody answered literally or pragmatically across the sessions within the same pragmatic task, and also for pragmatic tasks that were very similar to one another. So one type of scalar implicature to another one. But, there was basically no correlation between the scalar implicatures and the atypicality inferences, right? So I actually believe that also based on some of the other experiments that we've done, that different types of pragmatic inferences, to some extent, it may be related to, rely on different processes depending on what is actually required for making the inference, right? So sometimes it's highly conventionalized. Other times you maybe need to be, a bit creative in, how it could be accommodated and so on. And I think that that may be a large reason for why we don't draw to the same extent on specific cognitive mechanisms for all types of things that we call, pragmatic effects. But
yeah, what's really interesting actually when I saw your talk, Vera, is that you had an effect of, please remind me of the task, the updating task you used. There was the key, yeah, the KTT, the keep track task. And that did remind me a little bit of the updating task that I use, which is the NBAC task. And I think there's a logic behind us using those tasks. It's because, again, what Vera says, it depends on the inferences that you're trying to examine, but updating seems like a fundamental skill in those, maybe more so than, let's say, simple working memory. Because it's more of a processing measure as well. I also do some research in the field of multilingualism and cognitive differences and effects there. And there it's a really big debate at the moment that your task, and it sounds really silly, but it needs to be difficult enough. So sometimes with these relatively simple digit span working memory tasks, we don't find the effect just because there isn't sufficient individual variation to provide explanatory power. So that's another consideration.
Yeah, that's also what I think is with ACU quotient. There is just not enough variation usually in the neurotypical population. And even if you have a few outliers, this just doesn't suffice to I think there are studies on scalar implicatures from Bart Hertz group, and they have found some difference when they take high-functioning autistic individuals and compare it to neurotypicals and what they call still those times Asperger group, but they don't find a difference within between Asperger and neurotypicals. But also when I think about your results, it strikes me that this Raven matrix reasoning test is kind of similar to the task you did in the experiment, because you have shapes and you have to find patterns. So in a sense, yeah, one has to think always what is the specific task, linguistic task you are targeting, and what, if you find a cognitive test that's similar enough, then you might find an effect, yeah? Then always question arises what exactly it means. But I will start doing the Raven matrix task now because it looks highly promising. Yeah, that's what I would add here.
Yeah, Chris? Okay, so, one thought I have is that, maybe the superficial similarity of having triangles and circles and so on, I think, I'm not sure, I don't think that that is the driving factor here in particular, because, we also find this for the atypicality inference where there's no shapes, and also our other replication that I didn't talk about had, not these kind of geometric shapes. But about, so motivation may be another important factor, but then I'm wondering, to what extent is, the ease at which you're motivated and engaged in a task also an individual difference between people, right? So sometimes also in the psycholinguistic literature, people talk about, a tendency for, good enough processing, right? Like how deeply do you try to process, or are you happy if it seems like it's fitting with something, right? And then not going deeper, right? And I think that, these may also be individual differences that are not only related to the shape of the day, but that some individuals generally engage more deeply. It may, for instance, have a direct correlate with what we saw also in this kind of persistence parameter in the Raven's matrices model.
Yeah, thank you. I do think it's a very fair point, actually. I think a lot of the tasks themselves will correlate very strongly with each other, not necessarily because some people are that much more intelligent, but because they are more motivated to do the task. So this is something we definitely should keep in mind. Ideally, there would be some kind of longitudinal design where we check sort of consistency over time, etc. What I've recently started doing, for example, with the NBAC, is taking a lower threshold. So essentially what I'm trying to achieve is removing or excluding everyone who doesn't show sufficient engagement, right? If you perform at a childlike level on a cognitive task, either there is something cognitively wrong with you, but more likely you weren't invested in a task because you did it online and you wanted to get paid as quickly as possible. So to have these sort of checks in your battery, I do think is important to some extent.
Yeah, maybe not surprising regarding what I said in the talk, but I do think I do started doing some sort of questionnaires after experiments nowadays, because of course in more naturalistic experiments where people are interacting, maybe they use language in more natural manner, but we often do highly constrained experiments, and for obvious reasons, because it's easier to dissociate the factors and look exactly and test specific hypotheses. And then it may, you may find out that people do different things. Yeah? So especially for instance, in more complex tasks, such as in experiments which I have done where people have to consider the speaker knowledge. There is some avatar and this avatar knows something or doesn't. People start to have different hypotheses about, like, even though there is a clear instruction, some people still may suspect, for instance, that the speaker is cheating, or maybe he has a hidden knowledge. And this affects the way they approach the task, even though sometimes on a surface level in the experiment you cannot see it in your the kind of answers you collect as a target. And yeah, so it's good to ask to do some questionnaires and ask actually people how they understand these things and how they approach them.
Yes, so this last point I would also like to reaffirm from our experience. Sometimes, you know, we measure behavior in terms of choice, for instance, of an interpretation or the reaction time to that. But it's harder to know what's the reasoning process behind. And of course, there can be different processes that lead to the same response. So in our experiments, we found that when we additionally elicit, usually we do this on, you know, the last few trials in order not to get people to overthink, you know, during other parts of the experiment, but just like last two trials or something like that, right? To elicit their reasoning strategy in addition. Usually this information allows us, you know, gives us much cleaner data, right? Because then, you know, for instance, in the atypicality inferences experiment, right, we can find some people who do make the atypicality inference, right, but or ones who do not, right, and then among the ones who do not, we actually find that there's a mixture of some people who actually, in principle, you know, got the inference, but for moral or other reasons, they rejected it, right? They say like, but you always have to pay, so I'm not gonna draw this inference, right? Even though they got it, right? And the people who don't react to the redundancy of the information and don't go through this process, right? Now, of course, if you then, you know, collect these people's individual differences, and then you, you know, see like, oh, you know, it's really hard to find this effect. And in fact, it's because you're lumping the people who got the inferences but rejected it, right? You're lumping them with the, you know, wrong group of people. And if you can actually clean this up by eliciting the reasoning process, you get, I mean, at least we found that we get much clearer results.
Thank you so much for your very interesting and also very detailed question. Interestingly, so we provided contexts which made sort of the meaning of the novel, the nominal, sort of abundantly clear. That's why there was such a long contextual sentence. And actually, we pre-tested these sentences by having a separate set of participants paraphrase them. So we asked participants to paraphrase them because we wanted to know for sure that they were all sort of interpreted in similar ways. So in a way, the variation that you're hinting at, that you're asking for, we artificially removed it from the data because we wanted to make sure that everybody interpreted these denominals in the same way, because otherwise we thought, like, what types of neural mechanisms are we even measuring if we don't know how these individuals are interpreting these denominals, i.e. if they're large groups that have different interpretations from other individuals. So we sort of artificially got rid of that variability, but I do think it's something that would be very interesting to look at. And I also think that potentially with less context, so we're making it optimally easy as well for participants, right? Which is maybe why we're not finding the correlations with cognitive abilities that we were looking for. And maybe also why we're, for example, not finding differences in autistic individuals. So I can imagine that the harder you make it with the less and less context, the more sort of type of effects you find of cognitive ability and pragmatic inferencing ability. So that's certainly something interesting to take into account in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so one, in terms of what we can learn from these studies, right? Like one thing that I think is interesting is to look at kind of more mechanistic interpretations or understanding of how, making these inferences actually works. And I feel that, kind of more high-level computational models of this, like the RSA model, for instance, I mean, they've been great at, in principle, deriving these effects, but they're less amenable, basically, to understanding the mechanisms behind, right? And for this reason, I think, going to models that more draw directly on a cognitive architecture or reuse some pre-established processes that are consistent with other cognitive processing mechanisms, right, is particularly interesting in order to gain a deeper understanding and also derive new predictions of what we should be seeing in our experimental data, which we then can then proceed to test.
Maybe as a quick response, I mean, we met online before the symposium to discuss our topics, and I think we all sort of agree with each other quite well, so maybe that's not what you want to hear.
I think we are pointing to me because I am a philosopher, so maybe I have some insight on disagreements. I don't think this field of research is so. At least I'm not aware of some strong disagreements here. So it's more like we look for effects and. Markus has something. I thought you have something on disagreements.
I also think that there's lots of individual difference measures, and no study uses all of them. These also kind of correlate with one another. So you sometimes may have, one study that uses, working memory capacity as one predictor, but then didn't include certain other measures, right? And then, maybe that comes out as a significant effect, and then there's claim, working memory capacity is an important property here, right? But then I think we're to some extent still, lacking, maybe it is that there would be another correlate related to, general intelligence or, this reasoning ability or something along these lines that also correlates with the working memory capacity. But since it hasn't been measured, right, in that experiment, we can't draw that conclusion. But now we find that, in a different experiment, with different individual difference metrics, right, we may find that, there's like this beta correlator or so, right? But I mean, it doesn't, because many of these individual difference metrics that we have also relatively strongly correlated with one another, makes it, a lot more difficult basically to pinpoint, what is the most relevant aspect, especially because many of our tests don't uniquely just pinpoint one factor, right? So like the keep track task for updating and capacity, right? Or then, you see many studies that were about about theory of mind, for instance, but then they use a whole large variety of different theory of mind tasks. Some of them maybe target more strongly the perception, like the mind in the eyes task, for instance, right? Shows like, a little kind of snapshot of a half a face with the eye region. And the task is to say, what is the emotion, right? So that's very much a perception task, which is different from, reasoning about the emotion that somebody may have, right? And I think that there's like, it would be very helpful for the community to be more specific, basically, and conduct more experiments with respect to, what exactly are we measuring? Which aspects are we measuring, especially?
Sorry, just to respond to that, but also to get back to the previous question, I guess the biggest disagreement is on the tasks to use, but also what they actually mean underlyingly. Like what are we trying to do here as a field? What are we working towards? What should the next experiment be and the experiment after that, right? So when Vera presented, Maria and I were like, we should have included Raven's matrices, for example. So we're learning from this as well. But also, for example, in a lot of theory of mind tasks, some of the most dominant comments are not just about autism, but also that many of these tasks are highly verbal. So what we're just measuring is verbal ability in a general sense. That's why we're trying to go towards more and more sort of abstract cognitive tasks, to low verbal abstract cognitive tasks to tap into sort of really underlying just the cognitive abilities without the verbal abilities involved. But then even with the Raven's matrices, there are verbal aspects to the instructions and the explanations, etc. So I think as a field, sort of, it's not a disagreement, but it is something that everybody's sort of struggling with, and something you often hear from reviewers as a sort of as a response to different cognitive tasks being used, is what are they really measuring? What does that mean underlyingly? Isn't it just motivation that you're measuring rather than core cognitive ability? So that is something that is dominant in the discussion in the field at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. So the theory about N400 has been changing over years. So it has been observed initially for in the context. Basically, there was a P300 that was a prediction error ERP marker. But then in the 80s, they asked, do you get a similar effect if you have some violation of expectancy that is related to the meaning? And they instead of observed the N400. So there were variable functional theories on functional role of the N400, starting from semantic, reflecting some sort of semantic integration, lexical retrieval, and finally, nowadays, the mainstream view is that it reflects meaning-related prediction error. So it's a prediction error, but only in the kind of dimension of meaning. So it's not observed for syntactic violations. It's not observed for discourse structure violations, and so on. So does it answer your question, or you want more details? Yes, it's of course people use different terminology here. So there is not also, it's you will say that okay, it correlates with semantic expectancy, what that expectancy means, what should be also considered semantic here, because like if you look at papers by Lina Pylkkänen, she will say, okay, what psycholinguists talk about semantic expectancy, it's pragmatic actually, because semantic is only like a strong animacy violation or something like that, because that's the violation of semantic composition rules in language. But if you talk about, for instance, Dutch trains being white instead of being yellow, it's a violation of our word knowledge. You also observe the larger N400 there if you test it on Dutch people. She will say, okay, that's pragmatics, you know, that's not semantics anymore. So the terminology, it's not uniform, but speaking more, let's say, in round terms, you can say that it reflects meaning-related prediction error in language.
With a view on the clock, I think we have overrun our slot by quite a bit. So thanks a lot, everybody, for the contributions to the discussion.